All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you this afternoon for this next session. This next session is our communication session, and it's called Getting the Message Out, Effective Communications. I'm delighted to be with our distinguished panelists here today, and we're going to talk about some very important ways that you as advocates can get the message out in your communities, in your neighborhoods. Because we all know how important affordable housing is. We want everyone else to know how important affordable housing is. So I just want to gauge the audience just to see who here are communication specialists or communication folks. Okay, so I see a number of folks here in the room who are. Well, for the next hour, we all will become or will be communication folks because it is just that important. I am definitely sure about that. And so we want to provide you with all the tools that you need to go out into your community, to share with people how important housing is, how important affordable homes are in your community. And in doing that, today I have a distinguished panel with me today where we have Solis, who is she's the president and CEO of Make Room. We also have Amy Clark here, who is this is Amy Clark, who is the Senior Marketing and Communications Director with the National Housing Conference. And we also have Tiffany in the center of our distinguished panel.
I'm Solis with Make Room, and I'm thrilled to be here this afternoon. Thanks so much for having us. Make Room was started about 2 years ago. It was really emerged as an initiative out of the Enterprise Community Partners, which is a national organization that my colleague, Tiffany, there we go, is from. And 2 years ago, when Enterprise was really going through its strategic planning process, they're trying to focus on, what are the missing elements? Where can we really refocus our efforts and make sure that we are doing everything we can to meet our mission? And I don't have to tell anybody in this room that we are in an unprecedented time where renters are becoming a larger percentage of America more broadly, but we were focusing on low-income renters, 1 in 4 renters in America that are having to pay more than half of their incomes to rent. And that number in and of itself may not be very telling, but if we don't do anything or we continue down the pathway that we have been now for a number of years, we're likely to see that number really skyrocket to over 15 million households. So what does that mean, right? We hear so many numbers. You're in a place in Washington when we talk about an alphabet soup of programs and AMIs, and what we forget about sometimes are the people behind those numbers and who they represent. And so of those 11 million households, there are 4.6 million women impacted, over 8 million children. Millennials are the largest growing percentage of overburdened renters, but then there are 2.5 million seniors with a median age of 72 living on a fixed income, and they're paying upwards of 80% of their monthly income just to be able to rent. 757,000 veterans. So again, we forget sometimes who these faces are, what we call the faces of Make Room. And Make Room was really created at that time to help build a bridge, much like the work of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, many organizations in this room, my colleagues here on the panel. But we wanted to bring a unique approach to this. We really wanted to expose the human suffering that is happening behind closed doors, behind this issue that people don't talk about. When we hear about the societal challenges facing our country, education, healthcare, transportation, we rarely hear about housing. And yet the implications for all these other issues are so intertwined. And so we wanted to seek out an awareness and advocacy campaign that really focused on unhiding those issues and telling those human stories, the hard stories. It's good to tell the success stories, but so many people are suffering if we don't find a way to share those stories and for people to understand that they are our neighbors, our teachers in our schools, the people that are working in your grocery store. And so that's really was our focus. We'll be looking for solutions as well. So it's not just about raising awareness that this crisis exists, but also lifting up solutions. And for us, that means expanding the affordable housing supply that we have in this country. We need more homes, period, that are affordable. We also need to really look at new ways to expand rental assistance. We all know it's not enough, and perhaps there's new approaches that we can be looking at. We need to provide short-term emergency grants. One of the things that we learned in this last 2 years as we were talking to families that were impacted is that not everybody needs long-term help. Many times it's a family emergency situation, an illness. My husband died 7 years ago. Suddenly, you become a widow overnight. There are things that happen in our lives, and we need to have resources that support people at those different points in their lives. And I think not all the tools that we have today are not enough, and it's time to think about some new creative approaches. We also want to look at reducing regulatory barriers. There's so much happening at the local level that is prohibiting more homes being built. So that's another thing we'll be focusing on. I mentioned our unique approach. We wanted to make sure we were adding value to this industry. And so we are really focusing on humanizing the stories, coupling that with economic data and analysis to make the case. The other piece that's really essential is about empowering residents, and no other organization that I'm aware of does it as well as the National Low Income Housing Coalition and the partners here. But for us, we wanted to think about, is there a new way in this time, in this digital era, that technology can help bridge that gap, make it easier for low-income residents who often can't take time out of their, working 2-3 jobs to go meet with their local policymakers. But could we find some new technology approaches using smartphones, using all the data that's out there to better empower residents to both share their stories and become more civically engaged? So that's something that we are very much focusing on. And then our goal is to ultimately have 1 million advocates by 2020, really educating policymakers and working together towards solving this problem. So how did we do that? The first year we did a lot of really cool activations. You can go to Make Room USA and see some of the documentaries we did. We partnered with musicians around the country. People like Miguel and Carly Rae Jepsen donated their time, and we went into the homes of families struggling to make rent. We documented their stories over a 3-day period, and then they did a concert. It was sort of mirrored on the Harlem Renaissance era, where people used to come together and have rent parties when their neighbors couldn't make rent. So that was sort of the concept, a modern-day rent party. And it was fantastic, and we're hoping to continue to engage and create new stakeholders. We need celebrities using their status to be able to talk about this issue. But one of the things that we really wanted to focus on was creating a new digital platform. And we partnered with many organizations to think about what could that really look like. If we imagined a tool that would facilitate real-time conversation with policymakers, what would that look like? And so we set out to create such a tool, and it's still a work in progress. In fact, one of the things that we're really looking to do this year is to actually test pilot with residents around the country and find out, how do we make it easier for you to do this? But in order to get this tool out into the marketplace, we're a brand new organization, a small nonprofit. We got 5 staff, but we wanted to really sort of test out this platform. So we partnered with the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding, of which the coalition and many other partners are members of. And the idea was during the summer, when we didn't really have any legislation we were advancing, but we had a number of elections coming up, we wanted to begin to put messages out there about the importance of affordable housing, and we wanted it to become an election issue. And so we tested out we piloted the message platform, and we did some sort of gaming. We did incentives for people to engage. But the other thing that we did is we went and we met with members of Congress, and we got them to engage as well. And so over a 3-month period, we created a mechanism where residents could share their stories, because again, part of what we want to do is collect those stories, but also they could share these messages, simple messages, and members of Congress could send a tweet, write a message, connect pretty quickly to let us know when they were taking some kind of action. So it was a really great first-time effort, and we were able to send 154,000 kind of actions, and those were emails, tweets, calls, pledges. We asked people to take a pledge. We had 150 renters kind of share their stories, and then we were able to share those with key members in their districts. We had 100 members of Congress taking some kind of action, as I mentioned, and we were able to grow our subscriber network. That is the people that are engaging with us on a regular basis. So that's sort of the first test pilot of this model, and we knew we were onto something, but we certainly have more investment to take onto there. How am I doing on time? Okay, good. So the other piece of focusing on changing the narrative, right, so raising affordable housing as a national priority, was about, how do we get influencers to really understand that this issue exists? And so we focused on the storytelling that I mentioned, but we also focused on the media, local media, national media, different forms of media. The communications world, and Amy will talk more about this, is changing significantly. The way people are engaging and collecting stories is changing significantly. So we worked really hard at trying to get people like Rolling Stone and others, non-traditional housing folks, to hear about this issue, and we placed stories across the country last year, really focusing on that. Having local impact. We wanted to see if we could be a resource to local organizations on the ground. So in Denver, the city council really wanted to pass a first-time ever affordable housing fund. And they had interest there, the advocates were engaged, but they really lacked kind of a comprehensive experience on how to do a campaign. The city council knew they were going to need the support of Denver voters, and the polling had suggested that they weren't there yet. So we engaged with them for over probably a 9-month period, really just being additive to support to a coalition that was really forming. We helped bring advocates together with the business community and set new tables where conversations could take place. And then we created a digital platform for them to engage over that 9-month period. We helped place media stories throughout that time frame all across Denver, highlighting and humanizing the issue. And then we worked through the digital platform to engage advocates, so that when it came time for the vote, we had over 60,000 messages going into city council asking them really to pass the measure, which it did overwhelmingly on September 19th. So we realized there's a valuable resource that we can play, which is really supportive and additional to what's already happening on the ground in a lot of communities. And so that's the real focus of Make Room. We are expanding our digital platform. We would love to, I hope we'll get some time during the Q&A, because I know there's some residents here. I'd love to hear about what kinds of tools will make it easier for engagement, and how do we do that in new ways? And love to hear about what's happening in your communities and how an organization like Make Room could provide some support. So thank you so much for having me. I look forward to the questions.
Fantastic. Now we're going to hear from Amy Clark with the National Housing Conference.
Thank you, Renee. Are you able to hear me with my phone? All right. We'll hope that stays. Hope I stay audible. So I'm going sans slides today, so you can rest your eyes a little bit. Maybe don't rest them all the way into the nap zone, but do this together here. So I want to talk a little bit about how we broaden the constituency, broaden the base of support for affordable housing policy. I'll talk a little bit about some of the barriers that we face in doing this, and then talk a little bit about some of the things that we can do to improve our chances of getting some wins in our state legislatures and in Congress. And I think Tiffany is really going to add a lot to that as well. But one of the major barriers that we face is that most people don't even see housing as being a social issue, or as an issue that the government can do anything about. And that sounds crazy, I think, to a lot of us who do this work. I know it sounds crazy to people who need and rely on subsidized and public housing. But for most Americans, the way we interact with the place we live is in a transactional market way. So you pay your rent every month. You pay your mortgage every month. Something in your house breaks, you go to Home Depot, you buy a thing, you fix it. We have this very market-based relationship with our homes. And all of the stuff that government is involved in, the regulations, deduction, all of that's kind of invisible in the day-to-day that we live with our homes. And so if we enter into a conversation with people who don't think the way that we do and go right off the bat talking about, hey, the government needs to do something about this, that's not going to make sense to the average person who doesn't even see a government role in housing. So that's one barrier. Another barrier is more ideological, and I don't mean red, blue, left, right, Republican, Democrat ideological, although there's maybe some alignment. I'm talking about some other things. So first of all, there's liberty ideology. This is the idea that government has one role or another in our lives. So some people see government as having a positive role, and there's sort of a spectrum of this, and your thought about it can change depending on the issue that we're talking about. But positive liberty is this idea that the government has a positive role to play, and government action can bring you rights, it can bring you opportunity, it's a good thing. Negative liberty is this idea that we need less, right? Maybe we need to be protected from government, and taking away regulations and that kind of thing will make things better. The second ideology we need to think about is spatial ideology. And spatial ideology is essentially, you may have heard of it as the right to the city. Some of you have heard that term, but it's this idea that some people have a right to be in a place or to take action in a place. And there's a spectrum here as well. And you see it play out in, say, a neighborhood council, where the neighborhood council is trying to decide who can be elected to the board. And some people might say anyone, whether they're renters or homeowners, should be able to be on the board of this neighborhood council. And some people might say it should just be the homeowners because those people are really invested. And there's a whole spectrum of how we believe that people should be able to engage with space. You see it when maybe your city's done this, where they've installed new park benches in a city park, and they've put in those handrails every 2 feet to prevent people who are homeless from using those benches in a way that takes up more space. That's a spatial rights decision that they've made, right? People who don't have homes, who are going to use this bench in this way, don't have the right to this space. So we know from some research into persistent homeowner opposition to scattered site public housing that there's sort of an ideology nexus that predicts opposition to affordable housing, and that predicts support for affordable housing. So the opposition nexus, that place where you know that people are probably going to oppose, is people who have that negative liberty, let's have less government idea, and who believe in a limited right to space. You have to earn your way into the community. There's an opposite group of people who see a government role in life, and in particular in housing, and who believe that anyone, regardless of income, regardless of class, regardless of race or other sort of status, have a right to be in a space. So there's a whole spectrum of this, but we need to find and isolate and talk with those people who can be open to the idea of a government role in housing and feel like no matter who you are, you should get to be in whatever place, live in whatever neighborhood you want to. So how do we get to those people? So even if someone doesn't understand housing as a social issue, or that's something that government can do anything about, there's other issues that people care about, right? You look at polling, you talk to your member of Congress, you know that they care about things like jobs, they care about education, they care about healthcare. There's an intersection between housing and all of these issues, right? So segregation and inequality in our school system, that's hugely influenced by housing segregation and the way we plan our communities and the way where we put affordable housing. That's a place where you can have a conversation. Everyone in this room is getting older, and our health, some of us may be feeling that a little bit more than others, our health is incredibly influenced by our access to housing, our ability to age independently is really dependent on the type of housing that's available and the services that are connected to that housing and the community that's there. That's something that we can talk to people about. Jobs is the same thing. So we have huge growth in jobs that don't pay that much, and they're mostly growing in places that are really expensive to live. So if you want job growth, and you want people to be able to live in that place or relatively near to where they work, something has to be done about that. So those are places where you can make a connection. The other thing that we can do is think about how we tell our stories, and I think the Make Room campaign does a really good job of this, but we have sort of two options here. We can tell profile stories. We can tell stories about individuals, right? We have this one person or this one family that's had this experience, and this is the role that housing has played in that. Those are great stories if you want people to think about that individual. Those are great stories to tell if you want to raise money, but those are not great stories to tell if you want to get people to think about the systems and structures that are involved in allowing this person to live in an affordable and safe and decent home. You're cueing individual thinking when you're telling individual stories. So what do? You tell a landscape story. You zoom out from that individual and you tell a story about all the different systems and structures that are involved in that person's life and that family's life. So you know there's a job market that's in play in that person's life. You know there's an economic situation there. You know that the educational system plays a role. You know there's something going on in the housing market that's influencing whether or not this person is able to afford where they live. You know that the city and the state and the federal government are doing something in this space. So if you zoom out just from that individual, if you talk about the systems and structures, then you cue thinking about structural solutions. It's a structural problem. There are structural solutions. And that's going to open you up to being able to talk more about the role of government and help even people who haven't thought about it in the first place see that there's a government role, there's a legislative role, there's something we can do as a community through the system of government to have an influence and make people's lives better. So those are my thoughts. I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Fantastic. Great thoughts. Thank you. And so now I'm going to turn it over to the wonderful Tiffany Manuel from Enterprise Community Partners.
Great. So as they are putting the slides up, I'm going to say, I know the reason they put me last today. They put me last because I'm the person who has all the doom and gloom things to say. They're all inspiring, and I get to depress the heck out of you this afternoon. So, but actually, I'm gonna flip the script. I'm gonna be the one who's optimistic today. How about that? I am so excited to be here on a Sunday afternoon. It's hard. Sunday afternoon is tough, but that's all right. We're going to do it. And I'm excited because I'm looking around the room, and I feel like this is the dream team. I mean, these are the folks in this room, my colleagues at Make Room and National Housing Conference, but everybody else in this room who care enough to be here, to be talking about on a Sunday afternoon how we build a better place, right? How we build the support for the things that we know that for families that are struggling across the country, and how we build a better opportunity for those families. I'm going to talk a lot about the report. If I can put this off. You Don't Have to Live Here, which is the first in a whole series of both reports and trainings and a whole range of things that we want to do to help the field also wrap its arms around the very challenging thing of messaging in these crazy times to folks who I will say don't always respond the same way that we do when we hear the story of somebody who's struggling, who don't always get excited about the data and information that we share about the impact of affordable housing in our communities, who are not persuaded because we have all kinds of solutions to the challenges that face our communities, right? They don't get all excited about that. And so in order for us to bring them under the tent, right, to have them understand why we think it is important that we address issues of housing and community development, issues of concentrated poverty and disadvantage, and why we do that with some urgency, it is a challenge, right? So I promised I wouldn't go doom and gloom, but okay, but maybe I will. On second thought, let's do a little doom and gloom. So I want to say, we are undertaking this research with the Frameworks Institute. I used to be the research director there, and at one point the director of impact and evaluation. So I know the rigor with which Frameworks comes to this conversation, and our goal is to really bring an evidence-based perspective in terms of how you frame and message. So we're doing the best we can. Enterprise, I'm sure every other organization out there with the tools that we have. But what I also know is there have been some real advances in social science about how you really understand what we call the science of cognition, how people actually think and process information, right? How you get folks who may not see your point of view to come around to see your point of view. And they aren't always the ways that are intuitive. And so a part of our collaboration with Frameworks, with support from Make Room, early support we had from the National Center for Healthy Housing, some support from HUD, and the collaboration that we're now building across the industry is really important, is to bring forward some of that social science to really think about some very specific challenges. So the problem that we're trying to solve is, and I hope you all see this as true, that too many folks across the country just don't have a great shot at life because of where they live. Either the housing that they live in is not decent, right, fit to be lived in, or it costs too much for them to live there, or the communities that they have to live in that they can't afford, right, aren't connected to anything, right? There's no transit. There's no way to get to jobs, right? There's no way to send your kids to decent schools, or there's no way to kind of get grocery stores, right, that actually have stuff that you want to eat that's healthy for your families. And I could go on. But increasingly, many of us are living in communities of concentrated poverty. I often show these maps where you can see across metro areas the number of areas in our metropolitan cities that are growing in terms of just concentrated poverty, whole pockets of the cities, right? And you can see that over time. Since 1960, in almost every major metropolitan area, this is growing. And the problem for us in this room is it's not just that we don't recognize this, but there's no public outcry. Something's wrong with that. We see this happening. More and more families cannot afford to feed their families, right? To live in places that are affordable, and it's hard to get people, and I'm gonna be provocative today, but I'm gonna say it's hard to get people to give a damn, right? So, is that positive or not? You're positive. Okay. So here's the challenge. The challenge is that we have to find a way to talk to folks, to bring folks under the tent, right? We have to find a way not just to speak to the folks in this audience, but to folks, as I said before, who are not persuaded because they heard the story of somebody who is struggling hard, despite our best efforts to tell them. Or from my vantage, I'm a data person, so I get all excited by data, but folks are not excited because you got data, because guess what? They got alternative facts. That's what they call it these days, right? Right? They do. And so the challenge is we have to come at this in a very different way if our aim is to bring people under the tent who haven't been there before. So part of the conversation I want to have with you is to begin a conversation about how we begin to do that. And it's not always intuitive. So first I wanted to press you a little bit. I want to say, as we try to put forward really, good, honest messages forward, it often backfires. And so the report that I brought lots of copies out there in the foyer there for those of you who haven't seen the report, but just to fully articulate what are the ways in which the current messaging in our field is backfiring. So I often use this slide on the left side, as many of you in this room, right, housing and community development advocates, we are trying desperately to advocate for new solutions, policies. This is Enterprise, Make Room, National Housing Conference, everybody in this audience. And it's tough because the conversation we're having in this room doesn't translate very well to the kitchen tables of a lot of folks across the country. It doesn't. And so what often happens is what you see, we're on one side and there's folks across the boundary there, and there's a big chasm in between there. And what often happens when we try to message and say, hey, over there, right, we need to have better affordable housing in our community, is a backfire. Right? And I'm not just talking about the fact that people may not be interested in what you have to say, but when you say it, the thing that you say actually backfires. So one of the things that I often like to do as a part of our work with Frameworks, we often do on-the-street interviews. We go and put a microphone in people's face. We give them examples of how you message about this stuff, or for examples of how we message in the field, and we put a microphone in their face and we say, what do you think about that? And the stuff that comes out of folks' mouth is just incredible, right? But also for those of you who want to do this at home, social scientists on your own, Go to the newspaper, the major paper where you live, and look at just type in affordable housing. And when you see the article, what I want you to do is go to the comment section. Because that's a place where you can get, right, real honest commentary. You want to know how your messages are backfiring? Go look at it. So I brought a few today. So this was some in the New York Times. We know what helps the homeless. Now we need more funding. And just some of them, things like this. What about people behaving like responsible adults and living where they can afford to live instead of where they want? I'd love to live in Manhattan, but I can't afford it. Does that mean taxpayers should work harder to buy me an apartment and whatever else I want? This approach seems dubious to me, right? San Francisco, which is known for its huge homelessness population, has been throwing money at this issue of homelessness for years, right? Another, we can't help the homeless. We spend all this money on all they go on, about Obamacare and all this other stuff, right? That's an example. In our family, when we can't afford affordable housing in a particular locale, we move to a place where we can afford to live. There are many places in the U.S. where housing is inexpensive and unskilled jobs exist, and they give some examples. Provide a one-way bus ticket and have them move. This was in LA, a story about how much it takes for affordable housing. I've never met anyone who said they couldn't afford to move. If you're really poor, why can't you put your stuff in a couple suitcases and take a bus? Rent a U-Haul if you have furniture to move. I've known people so broke they had to borrow bus fare, but they still managed to move. Another one, that's the part I don't understand. No one is forcing you to live in one of the most expensive areas of the country. If you want cheap rent, go to South Carolina or someplace that's dirt cheap. You don't have to live here. And that's the title of the report. That's where they came from. Again, the only real solution, this country was built on mobility, moving to places where one can get a better life. Some of us want to live in LA because of what we do, but most people can live far better lives in the 90% of the country that's not LA, New York, and San Francisco. All the people in this story made poor life choices. Don't you love that? Literally, I could do this all day, and I have a bunch of, I love this one in DC, right, nation's capital. DC and the region is not doing enough to get rid of affordable housing. Our crime problems in DC are not coming from those in upper middle class households. They're coming from those living in public housing and income capped and subsidized housing. The sooner the people living in this, quote, affordable housing, which by the way is code word for low income housing, are pushed out of the region, the better. Gentrify DC, gentrify every last bit, push the criminal and parasitic class out of the city for good. If you cannot afford to live in DC, there's one simple solution. It's called moving. They're far cheaper cities, and no one is entitled to live here if they cannot afford it on their own dime. All right? So you get it, right? Y'all get it? When you try and get out of the rooms that look like this, where we all believe in affordable housing and try to engage folks about what affordable housing is, some folks with a little priming can get there. But there are a whole lot of folks, they're not coming to this party because they heard a story about somebody who's struggling. In fact, they will say to you, and we have videotape, people saying, you know what, life is hard. I'm a middle class person, I'm struggling too. I'm having a problem paying my rent too, right? But I don't want to pay my taxpayers going to those folks. And so what we've tried to do is the first layer of this research is not sort of get overly politicized, although I could go down that road, but I won't. But to begin to look at when people do push back on our work and our solutions and our thinking, what are the specific things that they push back on? How are they doing that? What are the narratives, right, that every time you message about or get up to talk about affordable housing is going to eat your message every single time? And so in the paper, we talk ad infinitum about these things. Probably the most powerful, I won't go through all of these. We won't have time for that at the top of the conversation, but I provided the report so you can look at it. Probably the most pernicious and the most challenging is this one at the top, when I call the mobility, personal responsibility, and self-makingness part of the backfire. I hope you heard in those commentary, every single one of them, move. Move. We don't want you in DC. If you can't afford to live here, I feel bad for you, but there are great jobs in Kansas, there are great jobs in Alaska, go get them. And there are great apartments you can afford. Right? When you put that mobility next to this personal responsibility, take responsibility for your life. This country was built, you saw it, this country was built on this notion of mobility. Go west, young man. You can't afford to live in DC? Move to Kansas. But what you won't do, right, is live in a high-cost market like DC, San Francisco, Atlanta, et cetera, and then ask me to subsidize your lifestyle. right? Housing is thought, as Amy was saying, as a consumer good. It's the same thing as going to buy a car. You don't buy the Maserati if you can't afford it. You go to Macy's, you don't buy the Louis Vuitton if you can't afford it. So don't buy the Maserati, which is a lifestyle in DC, and then expect me to come back and subsidize your car choices, your purse choices, right? Whatever the choices are that you make. And so when people are coming at this issue, thinking about housing as a consumer good, you talking about affordable housing, I can show you video of people in our focus groups, in our peer discourse sessions saying, affordable housing is where you can afford it. Affordable housing means move into a place where you can afford it. If you can't afford a lifestyle in DC, you have to move. This is not a place where you can live. And I'm really sorry about that. But that's kind of how markets work. And our telling a story from the vantage point of talking about a housing market reinforces that. Our conversations about affordable housing, I get the bad news is there's not a conversation you're going to have with broader public audiences where when you talk about affordable housing, that's a winning proposition. And it's going to be tough as we do this research to think about, to get our field to embrace different ways of having this conversation, because the ways that we're having it today don't work. So I won't go through all this. I'll say the only other one I'll talk about at this moment is this notion of separate fates, which is huge for us. Even for folks who have some empathy, they can see the work we're talking about and they see it's great, or they can see a family struggling really hard across town, and they'll say, that's so sad. But that don't have anything to do with me, because I'm across town and I'm struggling too. And I'm concerned about I'm middle class, and I'm concerned that my kid that I just sent to college and came back and is back on my sofa and can't get a job. I'm concerned that my wages haven't risen and my pension is a little bit in jeopardy and my job is not. So I'm really sad about that woman who's across town and her children, but I'm really concerned about mine. And so I don't see my fate as linked to her fate, right? Each one of us is doing our own thing. And so the challenge is when we're lifting up to the best of our ability, our work, what eats our matches time and time again is this notion of not feeling connected to one another in a way that would have you say, I need to solve that problem over there for that woman because it actually helps me, right? So I will say, if you don't remember anything that I've said today, if you think that lady is crazy in the middle, they put that one at the beginning because she's crazy. What I do hope you remember is something about the backfire effect. Now, the backfire effect, I didn't just make that up. There is a social scientific term called the backfire effect. Go home and Google it if you don't believe me. But the notion of the backfire effect, there are two things that are really important about that. Number one, you are not going to argue anybody out of that stuff. If you think you are, good luck with that. Have at it. You're not. You ever try to argue with somebody about personal responsibility? Right, because to some extent it's true, right? Could we all take more personal responsibility? Oh, yes. Is it true that there are jobs that exist in Kansas and Alaska that you could probably get that would pay? Sure, yes, it's true. Is it true that there are lots of folks who grow up in tough neighborhoods, go on to successful places? The secretary, right, of HUD is going to be talking to him about Ben Carson. His story is about, I was in a tough neighborhood in Detroit, which is where I'm from, and I made it, right? Is it true that people can't make it out of the? No. So are you going to argue anybody out of that stuff? No. Because there are these counterexamples, right? So for those of you who think, and especially I have to say, I'm saying this to myself as well, because sometimes I get excited because I think the data that I have is going to save the world. There aren't enough facts. There aren't enough facts, right? That there are facts that we can present that would get people out of this frame of thinking, right? And specifically, there's about 10 to 15 years of good social science research on this, which says not only are you not going to talk people out of this stuff, but the second part about it is the more you try, what happens? It gets stronger. And why? So let me just talk about why for just 1 second. It gets stronger because when you force people into a position where they have to defend it, even if it's wrong and you have evidence to say that it's wrong, now you force them to hunker down in it. Now I got to defend this stuff. And what happens is, what we now have in the political environment, which is folks are making up alternative facts, right? You're providing evidence, right, to the contrary, and they're hunkering down in it and just making up stuff. And this is not, right, this is not something that is unusual. Social sciences not only will, essentially you trying to argue somebody out of this, make it worse, but it actually increases, right? So you increase their confidence in their prior position, and it increases regardless of the evidence they're faced with. So let me just say this in conclusion. In the paper today, I'm not going to go over any of this, but I want to say there are 10 strategies, good framing strategies, for how you begin to get people up and over some of these challenges. So I talked a little bit about the separate fates. A good way to get people up and over that is telling the story of us versus the story of them, right? Not telling stories just about those, and I think Amy talked about that, how you widen the lens so people can see themselves inside of the story. That's the power of storytelling, is when people can see themselves inside of the story. We don't have time to go over some of these strategies today, but I want to say as part of this work, as the research kind of rolls out the second and third paper in this, we're going to try to begin to sort of partner with lots of you in the audience to do trainings and other kinds of things that begin to teach the field how you begin to lift up these practices that help you get up and over some of that stuff. And so, in conclusion, I would say the paper is outside. I'm happy to talk to people about it, and glad to be sharing the panel with my colleagues here to talk more about that.
So we do have a few minutes left in the session for questions. So we would love to hear your questions. We do have mic runners, as you know. And so what we're going to do, I want to get everyone in as possible. So I do see a question from Isabel.
It's on.
I wanted to ask, how do you get people who are quietly, silently supportive of affordable housing to speak up?
So, and I know you have some great tools for this, but I think we need to think about sort of a ladder of participation. So if you give people an easy way in that sort of fits whatever their comfort level is, maybe that's sending an email, maybe that's taking a survey, get them in on that sort of basic level, show them some sort of positive impact, reinforce that, you know, what you did was good and it made a difference, and then offer them more to do. But I think we need sort of an array of ways for people to take action. Not all of those things are going to be the highest power stuff, but if we're able to show them kind of a story of how they've had an impact, I think you grow a comfort level with advocacy.
That's good. Answer, yeah.
Let's take a question from over here on this side of the room. Let's go to Chip.
Okay, Chip Halbach, Minnesota. Both of today's panel discussions have been great, but I'm afraid they've been in the wrong order. It would have been very helpful to have the people who ran the campaigns or observed the campaigns, where you had 25 of the 37 with over 60% of people voting funds for housing to address the issues that you just brought up and the challenges that have been here. So I don't know if any of you are, I think Amy is, aware of some of the campaign messages that were so successful in getting voter approval and how it relates back to what the panel's been talking about.
So I'll just start. When we launched Make Room, before we did that, we spent a lot of time talking to great people like Mike Anderson, who I think is still here, and learning about what successful campaigns look like. Not just about the messaging, but the organizing and the continued engagement and what works and what doesn't work. And it's a continual learning process, right? I think what we're trying to do is find new ways to share those stories about what is working and what is not. Each community is slightly different, and so I think if you asked some of them, they'd say, generally speaking, these are some winnable, ways that you could get a successful campaign from start to finish. But for example, what we did in Denver is going to look very different than what's happening in Charlotte, where we're being asked to come and help them do something similar. The dynamic is different. The challenges locally are different. We may use the same tools and tactics, but I think the key about that is learning how you can adapt those winning propositions, those winning kinds of campaigns in like communities, and learn from those and get those best practices out there. What we also heard was toolkits are great, and we as national organizations are really good at putting them out, but they need a playbook, right? Sometimes they need somebody to be there longer term, not, throughout the process. So I think your point is a good one, but, and we're continuing to lift those up, and grateful for organizations like NHC that do a good job of statewide best practices.
Yeah, I'll just add to that too. I think there are two, for a lot of these places, there are two phases of the work. The first phase in a lot of places is that you get an initial set of just kind of basic housing policies passed, like things like a housing trust fund or some rezoning. Those are things that are safe. And then when you want to go beyond that, it gets a lot tougher because then you engender a whole lot of opposition that you didn't get the first time around. So I think there's lots of what's happening in the state and local policy efforts that are, for the first time, many cities are putting together housing trust funds. Many of them are beginning to get more present to this. Because the homelessness issue is a huge visible issue, they can get some things passed around homelessness. There's a model that works in terms of permanent supportive housing that actually saves, right, money for legislators, so they like that. But once you get beyond that, when you get, I think of that as tinkering around the edges, right? A couple units here, a couple units there. Once you really, fundamentally want to change the housing system, right, in its entirety to make sure that it serves people in that community, it gets a lot tougher, and the level of opposition, I think, changes. And so I think it's not just one playbook, it's many playbooks for the phases of the work, and thinking about the messages that you need in different phases of that work, so.
Question from the center of the room. Let's go here to Bob.
Thanks, Ed. So I'm Bob Palmer from Housing Action Illinois. So thinking about the newspaper comments that you're reading out, it seems like those are people probably in general who are just never going to support affordable housing. And so any thoughts from the panel in terms of counteracting the messages from people who are just not going to support affordable housing, whether that's based in their own economic self-interest or racism or classism or something else?
Yeah, I'll take that. I would say that's exactly right. There are lots of folks that we are never, ever going to convince to support the kind of policies that really advance a progressive agenda. However, the sort of narratives that you see reflected there are quite common and quite prevalent, right? And so we can learn a lot from that. But the other part of that is there really is what political scientists call the bystander public. The majority of folks are somewhere in the middle. They don't know what to make out of this. They don't really know, as Amy was saying, anything really about the housing delivery system or what takes place. They don't know enough to know if they're for it or against it, right? And so they're easily, I think, swayed. So the challenge for us is how do we educate folks, right, and frame it in a way that we can get folks educated so that when there is a referendum, a zoning policy, there's something on the ballot or something, that they actually understand it enough to be able to credibly step forward, right, and do something about that.
I will say, just to add on to that, the temptation often is to try to get those people. Like, I want everyone in America to believe the same things that I do about affordable housing, but that's going to be a waste of my energy and my time. It's those people in the middle that Tiffany's talking about who are actual potential supporters who we can educate about the issue, who we should be concentrating our efforts on. Just ignore the people who are never going to be with you because they're a waste of your time and resources in this work.
The only thing I would say is, in some ways, where we have policymakers, right, where they may be entrenched in a position, we have seen over time the ability to change their minds, right, and to educate them and to get them more engaged. Doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get them completely into a favorable, proactive position, but I think that's a lot of the important work ahead of us, particularly given the election results. This housing crisis is happening in every community. It is, to your point, I could point out places in Kansas and Alaska, right? So there may be one or two jobs, but housing affordability, as the report that the National Low-Income Housing Coalition puts out, is everywhere. And so that's a message also that needs to be out there and supported with both facts, getting people into a community. You want to talk about changing perceptions and minds? Have them go meet with people and see the community that they represent and that they live in. That is one way of doing it. And I would say, while we can't convince everybody, I do think there's a specific set of influencers that we're going to have to figure out how to bring them more on board.
Great, thank you. This may be our last question. How are we doing on time? 5 minutes. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Realizing that housing played a big part, but another thing come to mind that plays a big part, and I don't know how we can address it except for changing policy. We've heard a lot about policy today, and that is when a single parent is receiving subsidy and for their housing and their children, and they go to work, because many people do desire to work in spite of what is being said. But one thing that is a real problem is that if they make 1 penny, P-E-N-N, what? Penny. 1 penny over, all of their subsidy is cut. And so therefore, the mentality is that it's better that I stay home because my food stamps gonna get cut, my Medicaid gonna get cut. So I mean, in essence, we have to tackle a lot of these things together and come up with something that the legislature will embrace, so that many people can move forward. Because when you are stuck, when everything that you need will be taken away because of 1 cent, and it's not a tier of, bringing it down to the point where you don't need anything. So, I mean, have any of you thought of how we can get to that point?
So, government programs aren't perfect, right? And you are giving us a very clear example of how it's good, but it's not great when that's how it's working. And what we need to be able to do is criticize government without undermining it. The concept that we can use here is called citizen manager thinking. So as a citizen of this country, and I'm not talking citizen like I have papers, but citizenship, right? Like I care about this place that I'm a part of. As a citizen of this community, the government is here to carry out my wishes and to do the things that we all have agreed to do as a community. And as a citizen manager, I want these programs to work better. I don't want them to go away. I want them to work better. And this is my idea for how that can happen. But it's very important when you're doing your lobby visits, and I know many of you have these coming up, to not go in just with criticisms and say this is all garbage, because there is a lot of garbage, right, in any system, right? There are issues, but we need to come first and say this is something that's important. There are changes that need to be made, but I value this. I value this structure. It's important for our community.
I think that's exactly right. I think that is I think that's exactly right. The only thought I wanted to say to the audience about that is, when we look at the history of social policy in this country, it helps us to understand that that challenge is on purpose, right? That is by design, right? And the design is, right, if you read, Francis Fox Piven and Cloward writing in the 60s, 70s, we're talking about social policy and policymakers coming from the vantage point that they didn't want to provide enough through entitlements for you to actually be able to make a living, or for you to actually be able to support your families. And so they wanted to make it difficult enough that it would be uncomfortable enough that you would be so miserable in those circumstances that you would do everything in your power to do something else, because they thought that was an incentive. The fact that you were in these miserable circumstances would force you to use your ingenuity, get out there and get those bootstraps going, right, to do something different. And so when we think about the design of policy and the logic, it's not that the people don't know that exists. That historically has been the way that it's been designed. And the narrative around that, right, this is why this narrative conversation is important, is that you won't be incentivized to do anything else if we don't right? If we give you enough to live off. I think we have to fundamentally provide counter narratives to that. And I will say, we've been losing that war for a long time. When we battled welfare reform in the 90s, unfortunately under Clinton, this notion about having to deservedness and having to work first and all of this foolishness, we lost that narrative, and all of the stuff that's come after that is all wrapped up in that conversation. So I will say, this moment where just because of the environment, we're going to have to battle on the level of narrative. We have to change that conversation, and being thoughtful about how we do that is why this communication stuff is really important. We cannot lose the narrative again to that kind of foolishness.
Fantastic. And I love how you snuck in that Oprah Winfrey type question to get to the heart of it. So thank you for asking that question. Thank you to my panelists. Fabulous discussion. And things that we can all take back to our communities to elevate affordable housing and the message. So thank you.